So we have one system, which is the old banking and financial system, which is on this side. That's the dead past. We bury that. On this side, we have a new system. How do we make the transition? And how do we make it globally? Because it's a global problem. And you cannot have prosperity in part of the world and the rest of it going to hell. You must reorganize the planet as a whole. And there is a mood for that, as you can see, of many nations around this world right now. So that's what we're going to respond to, and that's what we're going to address. Now, there are three parts to address. First of all, with the help of John Segerson and his co-conspirators, we'll have some maps, which I'll get into very shortly, which I'll take pretty much in the order they have them to simplify the way in which this runs. Make it a lot easier to get the job done. And if there are imperfections in the order, don't worry about it. You'll get the general idea. These maps are going to be used again, and diagrams are going to be used again with more amplification for a number of publications. So we're not going to try to give you the whole shebang now, but just give you a sense of what we're going to do and how it's going to work. The basic thing, since we're going to have to use public credit, since you cannot get private investment when private investment has gone bankrupt, in order to create large-scale projects of employment, you have to rely entirely on public credit. And I would suggest that we use the general rule, which is probably an acceptable general rule in the world today, that the public sector in economy is essentially infrastructure, government regulation of banking, which is really part of the infrastructure, the way we used to have bank regulation, and currency regulation. The government is responsible to protect the currency. Foreign trade, interstate commerce. Those are the government's functions, essentially, in our country and similar in other countries. But the most essential characteristic of the government responsibility for economy lies in general, basic economic infrastructure. Transportation, large-scale water management systems, the development of adequate power systems, education, general education, public health, the provision of public health facilities for which the private physicians work in order to provide a health care system which is adequate for the needs of the nation, and general public education, of course, and science. The government must specifically promote science in ways which are typified, for example, by the NASA project of the 1960s, or the middle 1960s, before they began to take it down. That we should employ, perhaps globally, about 5 to 10% of the population of the labor force should be employed in scientific endeavors today if we're going to continue to generate sufficient technological capability to meet the overall needs of this planet and its population. This will be clear as we go along. But the essential thing is this, which leads right into the maps. And then we'll get into this question of creativity. The one area internationally in which you can organize a global explosion of real economic growth is in public infrastructure building of nationwide as projects which are an extension of international projects, typified by the idea of a high-speed, preferably magnetic levitation rail system for freight as well as passengers, reaching from Brest in France on the Atlantic coast, by way of Paris, through places such as Berlin and Warsaw into Moscow, and on to places such as Vladivostok, down into China, across the islands down into Japan, and across the Bering Straits down into the United States and South America, of course. And that is a characteristic project, which was a project which was proposed by two statesmen at the end of the last century. One was a protege of Pope Leo XIII, who was really the first modern pope to recognize modern society, and a protege of his in France, who was Gabriel Anatole, the French foreign minister, diplomat, and so forth, together with a great Russian genius who was the friend of a genius by the name of Mendeleev. And they organized this system of railroads to get the British out of China and to involve Japan. In about 1896, they had set up a nest of treaty agreements and other prospective agreements which would have done exactly what I just outlined in terms of rail development, except from that standpoint. The British caused World War I in order to prevent that cooperation using Venetian methods. And they got a Teddy Roosevelt in the United States who was not loyal to the United States. And they got an outright traitor and disgusting person, Woodrow Wilson, and that was the end of the United States for this century. And people like that. So these kinds of projects which require international credit cooperation to create, which are rail projects, large-scale water projects, we'll get into some of this and show you what this involves. These kinds of things are the key to world recovery, to getting to the other side of the river, across the river of chaos, from this side, which is doom, to the other side, which is survival. On the other side of survival, the transition through projects begun now, at least in germ form, continued with the idea we will expand them under the new system. And that's the way, through this kind of public financing, through international cooperation, to get a revival of the world economy, including the private sector as a whole. Look at the map again. And let's turn to the map. Now let's look at the kind of world we have to organize. John, you got start with the Eurasian continent. I can't see it from here. Oh, okay, good. And now, you've got to look first of all at physical geography. Just imagine you're coming from a foreign planet. And you're planning to colonize the Earth. This is what you'd look at, wouldn't you? At Eurasia. And you would say, well, we got to fix that for human habitation. And fixing an area for human habitation, the first step is what we call infrastructure. So now you can look at Europe, which is an area we'll focus on. Europe includes the center of this whole project. We've got another area which is called East Asia, which is centered around China, Japan, and so forth. And then you've got, I got South Asia that got in there somewhere, or that's not, all right, fine. And now let's look at the Middle East. Now it's fairly good, which we've got a third project. So we've got three projects. One is what was called some years ago the Triangle Project, the Productive Triangle Project, which I proposed to my wife in our discussions, by phone at the time, regrettably, in 1989, and she got other people organized to do, and we produced a proposal for this general kind of development. And that's number one. Three parts of this. Part number two, which is what we called then, back in 1983, was called the Pacific Indian Ocean Basin Development Project, which I wrote up a report and published a lot of material on then, which involved China, the island rim of East Asia, involved subcontinent of Asia, involved the east coast of Africa, involved the Middle East, of course, which is there, and the west coast of the Americas. This entire area, which includes Australia and New Zealand, is within a body of water, the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And if you look at the surface of this area, the water surface, you will find that India is very much ocean-bound. India, which has about, the Indian subcontinent, which has about 1 billion people or so, has 1/3 the area of the United States, and a lot more sea in terms of inland, in terms of total acreage or total square miles. The amount of coastal miles are very high. So that very slight development, that essentially India is a maritime civilization by modern technological standards. The coastal area of China, similarly, and if you had an inland water development system, water-made development system in China, then you would have, at the same time, you would have the ability to move your infrastructure development into the deep interior of China. You add a modern rail system to China with a tight grid, and suddenly now China essentially can function very effectively in respect to its ocean surface. And China becomes then a maritime nation in this degree, in its relationship between India, its relationship with the Americas, its relationship with Australia and Southeast Asia, becomes essentially a maritime relation. East Africa, the same thing. East Africa is a part of this area logistically, and therefore the development of this area in its infrastructure, particularly with a maritime orientation and inland waterways and rail systems from the coast inland, that is the essential characteristic of this thing. Now, the East Asia and South Asia part are linked to Europe in two ways. The primary way is from China and Japan and the Bering Straits through Moscow into Western Europe. That aspect of the thing is what we call a Eurasian land bridge, typified by the upgrading of the railway system, the Trans-Siberian Railway System, in which the China development of rails, and there are two Silk Road rails, one which is the one that goes up and intersects through Kazakhstan, the Trans-Siberian Rail, and one going with a more southerly route. And these become, China then becomes an inland role, has an inland role in respect to Europe through a rail and inland waterway system. And India comes in under the same thing. We have a third area which is crucial. And let's look at the Oasis Plan Zone. I think you have that there is one under A51. Okay. Now, the key thing here, as you can see, is this area, first of all, can be characterized as the crossroads of civilization. In the earlier history of mankind, the Middle East was the link between the Mediterranean civilization, which was European civilization, and the Indian Ocean. And thus that's the crossroads of civilization. It has two significances. First of all, it is vital that we have peace in this area for two reasons. First of all, the Perez, Rabin, Arafat peace plan is necessary, is something I've worked for over 20 years, and actively with them and with both the PLO and others, and on the Arab side and with Israelis on the Israeli side. And finally, it looks as though it's being done. It's not yet successful. We intend to make it successful. But this crossroads of civilization is also a paradigm for the principle of cooperation based on common interest, which we hope to make more general throughout the planet.